All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Zoom into Archaeology series. We are so excited to have our speaker for today, Dr. Morgan Smith. Dr. Smith is with the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And I'm going to do just a really quick, brief bio and then just hand it right over to him because I know you all came here not to hear me speak, but to hear him speak. And so Dr. Smith is an anthropologist focusing on the late Pleistocene peoplings of the America's studies of hunter-gatherer groups, prehistoric adaptations to climate change, and the archaeology of underwater landscapes. He joined the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga from Texas A&M University, and also served as an archaeologist with the National Park Service's Southeast Archaeological Center. He's an expert in geoarchaeology, archaeological geophysics, and Paleo-Indian archaeology in the Americas. And so with that said, I'm going to go hand it over to Dr. Smith and let a few more folks in.
Okay. Thanks so much for that introduction. This is my first time doing a Zoom lecture, so bear with me here while I get things figured out. Let's see. It's kind of weird to be talking with no interaction from the audience, but here we go. Yeah, so basically, I'm going to be talking today about some really exciting new discoveries that have been occurring in the Apalachee Bay of Big Bend in the Gulf of Mexico. And essentially what I'm going to be talking about today broadly is the archaeology of submerged prehistoric landscapes. So oftentimes we hear about underwater archaeology, which is very often synonymous with historic resources like shipwrecks, which are remarkable resources, but there's quite a bit of prehistory down there as well. And I'm going to kind of basically give an overview of submerged prehistoric landscapes, talk a little bit about why. I think the discipline is kind of heavy towards the historic resources. A lot of that has to do with site detection. Pre-contact sites often elude site detection. I'm going to talk a little bit about how sites are detected and some advancements that are going on into that. And then I'm going to segue into talking about a new site, which was recently uncovered in Apalachee Bay and kind of what that means for Florida archaeology in general. All right, so we'll kind of keep moving on here. So again, this is this quick outline. What are the current methods for finding pre-contact sites? Why is it important that we kind of improve these methods to recognize more pre-contact cultural heritage? What is new in the Apalachee Bay? What's this new site that I kind of mentioned in my talk title? And why is it significant? As far as submerged prehistory goes, anybody who has kind of been out in these areas understands the enormity of the problem that is identifying submerged pre-contact sites. In this figure here, red areas are inundated lands that were exposed during the last glacial maximum. So during the last glacial maximum, which was the Wisconsin glaciation, the last glacial maximum occurred around 24,000 years ago. So that's the peak height of the last ice age. And during that time, tremendous amounts of fresh water are locked up in glaciers that are parked over most of what is now Canada and North America. And that drastically lowered sea levels about 130 meters worldwide. Now, obviously, we don't have people in the Americas during the last glacial maximum. That doesn't come around until about maybe as early as 17,000 years ago or so. But even at that point in time, sea levels are roughly 70 meters lower than they are today, which means particularly in areas like the Gulf of Mexico, which has a very low relief, gently sloping continental shelf. That means that land extends quite a bit out during the initial colonization of the Americas than it does today. So what are the current methods used to find these sites? One of the more common ones is referred to as the Danish model. And the Danish model is basically a morphologic model at the end of the day. All site detection models for pre-contact archaeology currently rely on finding what you'll always hear as high probability areas. And high probability areas would be places that would be attractive to hunter-gatherers. So for example, in this right image here, we have a multi-beam image from the Gulf of Mexico with this beautiful meandering river belt system here. A freshwater source like this would be obviously very attractive to pre-contact people. So that would be a good place to start looking. Pre-contact archaeologists don't really have concrete ways of identifying sites. It's not, like for a magnetometer, for example, used to find shipwrecks or historic resources. Currently, there's nothing that accurate. So we kind of have to do a little bit of landscape reconstruction. And that's the basis of the Danish model. It's basically finding areas that are likely to have pre-contact resources, so not guarantees. And this has kind of been pointed out by actually one of the kind of originators of this method, or somebody who's had quite a hand in submerged pre-contact archaeology in Denmark, Dr. Ole Gran, who recently published a paper that modeled this method and compared it with basically terrestrial analogs. And he found that this Danish model may only be predicting less than 1% of sites within a given area. So, obviously 1% is better than 0%. And given the shortcomings of site detection, this is better than nothing, but we're still missing quite a bit of archaeology out there.
Hey, Morgan, sorry to jump in real quick. It looks like the slides are still stuck on the first one. So you might need to go into slideshow and click presenter view, and then we'll be able to see it when you do that.
Presenter view.
Yeah, at the top, you see there's like a home, and then you go kind of move across the top, and it'll say slide view.
From beginning?
Yeah, do that, and then maybe we'll skip. You can skip to where you should be at. There you go. Oh, getting a weird kind of view here. It looks like it's zoomed in. There you go. All right. Okay. Yeah. If you want to go ahead and try to move through with the arrows. There you go.
Okay. Now we're in it.
All right.
All
awesome.
Right.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Okay, then I think that means that that's been, maybe you guys missed that. I'm not really sure. But here are the images from the Danish model. Here's this multi-beam image that I was referring to that may not have been visual to you. So that's the first model, is the Danish model. And the second one is basically using surficial geophysics to identify sites. Now, when I refer to surficial geophysics, that's something that's not going into the substrate. So typically in underwater archaeology, this is side scan sonar. Side scan sonar ranges between about, anywhere from 400 or 500 to 2000 and above kilohertz. And it has very high resolution that does not penetrate the sediment, and it does paint a really nice image of what's on the surface. The problem with using this method, though, for pre-contact sites are that, well, first of all, not all pre-contact sites are exposed on the surface. It has been used successfully in a couple examples. So on the left here, this is an image produced by Quentin Mackey and his team. This is in Hecate Strait in British Columbia. And it looks like there's a possible structure here shown in the side scan sonar imagery. It's interpreted by Mackey and colleagues as a house structure, which would be really interesting because this is on about a 13,000-year-old shoreline or so. So this would be quite an old house structure. The other image on the right is a well-known example from the Great Lakes. John O'Shea and Ashley Limke have been working up there, and they have identified caribou hunting drive lanes and blinds, which are exposed on the bottom of the Great Lakes. But as I said, not all of these features are always exposed. They're often buried. Exposure to the water column also presents issues of geologic context. And early hunter-gatherer societies, we don't typically expect them to leave behind very large structures that would be observable with surficial geophysics anyway. So both of these methods, both of these current methods for identifying pre-contact sites have their pitfalls. And basically, kind of quick example of pros and cons of each. Obviously the Danish model has some theory to it and is testable and refinable and very applicable. But obviously a huge drawback there is that it may be missing as much as 99% of the archaeological record in a given area. The Surficial geophysics model is very rapid, very quick, relatively inexpensive way of targeting sites offshore. But again, obviously surface sites are less likely with pre-contact archaeology, and this only identifies sites with surface context. So this is a really important issue to improve upon, if for nothing else other than socioeconomics. The CRM industry is hiring many archaeologists, over 10,000 a year, who generate about $1 billion. And in addition to lost cultural heritage, this could also be a lost revenue source. The greater breadth of site identification means more revenue streams. More revenue streams means more hiring potential for archaeologists, and more hiring potential means more undergraduate and graduate student options. So it's kind of a good thing to improve on, because it can create sustainable growth in the discipline. Within offshore cultural resource management, where site detection is sorely needed, this is a pretty rapidly increasing issue as we start to see proliferation of offshore capital development. So particular offshore renewable energy is growing quite rapidly. And this is something that is concerning, because right now companies are breaking ground on the continental shelf for offshore wind farms and obviously offshore pipelines. And all of this is being done without an accurate method of identifying pre-contact sites. And this is something that really needs to be addressed moving forward. A lot of stakeholders have kind of recognized that this needs to happen. It's a seminal paper written by Dr. Michael Fott and Nick Fleming, two household names in submerged pre-contact archaeology, have likened it to finding a needle in a haystack. And it really is quite true. Anybody who's been out in the Gulf of Mexico or on the Gulf of Mexico can immediately recognize the enormity of the problem. There's a lot of water out there, and it's very difficult to find any of these sites. So we also know that, in identifying more sites, we can do more research out on the continental shelves, and that will lead to refining methods, and again, kind of a sustainable pattern that's cyclical, and will help us enhance site identification and protection. This is something that I've been working with on the been working closely with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, including the Artificial Reef Program. So the Artificial Reef Program is a group that we partnered with to increase the identification of these sites offshore. They deploy artificial reefs all over the Gulf of Mexico. And we've been working closely with them, training their marine biologists on how to identify pre-contact resources in addition to historic resources. And this is also something that law enforcement has recognized as a need, because currently we do know that there are offshore looting operations going on. And currently we don't know where any of these sites are, or at least law enforcement doesn't. And it's very difficult for them to protect what isn't identified. So this is a pressing issue and really needs to be addressed. And like I said, we're kind of working with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to make this happen. Something that we've seen in the few examples of archaeological sites that are present offshore is that, I think it's often thought that sea level, when it transgressed during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, acted like a bulldozer and just completely destroyed everything. And I think that's something that's often been kind of used to reason the lack of offshore archaeological sites, is that, well, they've all been destroyed, right? Or most of them have been destroyed, at least. And what we've been seeing is that, while it's certainly true that marine transgression was probably a destructive process, that preservation offshore is actually quite variable. And there's a lot of things going on here where we can actually get pretty astounding preservation. So on the left is a well-known example of the recently discovered Minnesota Key offshore burial ground in South Florida. So this is a part of the kind of Florida mortuary complex during the Middle Archaic. And the preservation there is quite phenomenal to the degree that organic materials are preserved. So here you have a couple wooden stakes from the site. These are things that are commonly not thought to be preserved in marine contexts, but Dr. Ryan Duggins and his crew from BAR have proven that that's not necessarily the case. On the right-hand side is an image from the site that I'm going to be introducing in just a couple slides here. That's a image from this newly discovered site in Apalachee Bay. And what's interesting about this image here is that all these artifacts actually refit together. This is a single core, a lithic cobble that's been reduced. And when we were surveying the site, we came across a couple of these areas which looked like discrete napping areas. And we could actually refit some of these pieces back together in situ. And I'll show you some of these in just a second. The area of the Big Bend that we're going to be focusing on here today is a known area that has a high concentration of archaeological sites. So within the greater Southeast here, these are underwater Paleo-Indian and early archaic sites known in the Southeast US. Most of these are found in reservoirs or rivers. And you can see there's only a handful or so outside of the state of Florida. Once you move into the state of Florida, things go quite crazy. You know, there's a lot of things that are that help out Florida's case in underwater archaeology overall. Lots of water, karst environments that produce constant deposition and sedimentation that allow for burial of these sites and preservation of these sites. And as I mentioned before, kind of a low relief continental shelf extending quite a bit out into the Gulf of Mexico. So quite a few sites here in Florida, and indeed in this river basin, the Paleo River drainage and surrounding areas, which we're going to be talking about here in a second, is the highest density of submerged pre-contact sites in the Americas currently. So what's the deal with this new site in Apalachee Bay? The newly discovered site is Clint's Scallop Hole, named for Clint Peters, who, you guessed it, was scalloping when he discovered it. And this actually was a really great example of how FWC and archaeologists can kind of work together, because through a pretty close relationship with FWC officers in the area, we've been kind of talking about these marine resources for a long time. And Clint, who's not an archaeologist, but who was familiar with the kind of work that we were doing, was out scalloping one day and saw these boulders in the area and rocks. And he sent an email to Joe Davis, who is the wildlife management officer for the Alcilla River Wildlife Management Area, who got in touch with me. And when we first actually headed out there to the coordinates that Clint gave us, I think what ended up happening was we actually found a completely different site than what Clint actually identified originally. So just for reference here, you know, here's 8JE 1796, Clint Scallop Hole. The water depth in this area is super shallow, about 2 meters. This is only about 5 kilometers offshore. And based on recent sea level data and sea level reconstructions, we know that this landscape was inundated by about 3,000 years ago. And the really interesting thing about Clint Scallop Hole is that there have been a handful of sites found in this region of Apalachee Bay, but Clint Scallop Hole is actually an archaeological complex where there's literally dozens of these localities in the area. And it's this wide complex of quarried chert outcrops. And as I mentioned, I don't think we actually relocated the exact area that Clint Peters found. I think we actually stumbled across another outcrop entirely. But here's a little bit of context for the new site discovery. So here we have some reconstructed paleo drainages. This is work done in GIS by Dr. Ryan Duggins, who's a state underwater archaeologist. This is an image over here from his dissertation where he used GIS data to kind of reconstruct these paleo drainages offshore. And what we've seen is that the Paleo Oscilla still has a pretty high concentration of archaeological sites. And outside of that, outside of these river drainages, there really aren't a whole lot of sites. Scalapole is right here, and this kind of star right here is number one is Scalapole. So it's interesting that it's in between these drainages. This is interesting because there are two primary models for hunter-gatherer movement in the Paleo-Indian and Archaic Southeast, and they basically say that, you know, there's movement along and among drainages, and we see movement along drainages quite often, and this high density of sites and artifact scatters along these drainages is evidence of that. But these sites in between also give us, also demonstrate to us that there is movement between drainages as well. So this is an aerial image of 8JE 1796 Scalapole. And what you have here are, so here are our two research vessels. This is the FWC law enforcement vessel. And this is Scalapole. So this tiny circle right here is Scalapole. The dark areas are seagrass beds. And so far, every single one of those white patches around here, each of those is a quarried archaeological site. So we're talking about a pretty huge landscape here, and this is really exciting because this is indeed a submerged landscape. So we do have this wide area actually that is a complex of different archaeological sites where people, and probably a large aggregation point on the landscape for hunter-gatherers, people are coming here over and over again to extract what we see is actually pretty high quality tool stone. So tool stone in the state of Florida, chert is what I'm referring to, is pretty hit or miss in terms of quality. You know, you can get some really high quality stuff and you can get some really low quality stuff. And what's out here at Scalapole appears to be, it also kind of has a range, but overall it appears pretty high quality. So here are just a couple images of some of the work that we've been doing out at Scalapole. So as I mentioned, the site was discovered in 2018. We went back out to collect more accurate GPS numbers in 2019 and actually took several Florida State University students out there as part of an archaeological field school. And here's some example. Basically, we set up a baseline offset mapping system at the north and south ends of the site. And the area that we're in is basically very shallow substrate. There's about 15 to 20 centimeters of sediment overlying limestone bedrock. And this is Oligocene aged limestone with these kind of concentrations of chert, which is called Swanee chert, that's outcropping in the area. And what you see here is another example of one of those kind of discrete flint napping areas that we think we've identified. So this boulder actually refits right here to this boulder. And we've refitted a number of these other pieces back together. And it appears that there's kind of different concentrations and different napping areas all across the site. And as I mentioned, these are kind of all over the area that we're in. Here are some archaeologists, Florida State University archaeologists or archaeological students mapping the surface lithic scatters at the site. So we didn't excavate, we only collected a sample of what was on the surface. And we did this with baseline offset mapping, which is a pretty quick and dirty way of mapping a site where you have, you know, one baseline stretched all the way across the site, which is this here. And then you just map X and Y coordinates with another real tape of each artifact found. There were, so we're talking about a quarry site, which means by definition, most of the material there that's going to be found is stuff that was not kept. So the objective pieces were removed off-site. So things like bifaces and tools and whatnot. And the items that were left on site were either errors or part of the flint napping process. So not a whole lot of diagnostic artifacts here. As far as we could tell, no artifacts beside lithics. So no bone, no ceramic, no nothing like that. Here's a diver bagging one of the few bifaces that we actually did find at the site. This is an early stage preform. And I'll just go through a couple images here of some of the artifacts found at the site. So there were everything from kind of early stage, very large cores. There were actually a series of bedrock cores found at the site. So bedrock limestone, which has chert inclusions in it. So stuff that was obviously mined by these people, but that we couldn't remove from the site, obviously, because it's bedrock. A couple tested cobbles. So these were kind of scattered all over the site. You know, you'd pick up, you'd find these all over the place where basically there are these cobbles that somebody struck once to see whether or not the material inside was worth working. Several hammerstones, though not very many. And most of the hammerstones that we found appeared expedient. You know, these ones just have a couple impact marks on them from maybe expedient use. They're limestone also, which is interesting because trying to nap chert with limestone is very difficult as it's softer than the rock. So perhaps these were used as later stage cores or refinishing, later stage hammerstones or refinishing hammerstones. Here's kind of just like a representative sample of some of the smaller cores found at the site. So several of these, which you can kind of see here with specimen J and specimen T, specimen N also are pretty high quality. And a lot of these, here's your scale there at about 10 centimeters. Some of these appear exhausted, where people were intentionally removing as much as they could of high quality raw material. And this is a pretty interesting specimen that I'll come back to later. So item U here appears to have a couple facets, which you can actually kind of make out, one here and one here. And there's two more on the back side. These look like intentional blade removal, which I'll expand on in a bit. As I mentioned, there's really not a whole lot of tools found at the site, and the tools that were found at the site were either pretty expedient, roughed out things, or you know, expedient utilized flakes. So there were 5 total bifaces found at the site, all of which are kind of represented by early stage preforms. So we have things that are specimen D here is actually made on a gigantic core reduction flake. So this is the platform down here. So this is a very large flake, but it's been, you can see it's been kind of nibbled into a rough biface stage, but was discarded. Specimen E would qualify maybe as a stage 2 biface. That's the latest stage item recovered at the site so far. And then this is just kind of all items identified as tools from Quint Scallop Hole. You can see the vast majority of them are these bifaces that were found. So there's 5 bifaces in here that are pulled out here for your viewing. And then the remainder are basically kind of just a whole pile of mess where they're just all over the place, really. All of these are expedient utilized flakes, really. There's nothing else in the tool assemblage besides bifaces, a single uniface, fragment of a uniface, and several utilized flakes. Another interesting part about the lithic assemblage is that there's actually quite a few, so in addition to that possible blade core that I showed earlier, there are a lot of flakes that we would call blades or blade-like flakes. Oftentimes, blades are kind of a throwaway term where they can mean anything from something that's twice as long as it is wide to something that is intentionally produced to maximize cutting material, because blades are pretty efficient in that regard. And HAE 1796 actually has quite a few things that qualify both as true blades and as blade-like flakes. And this is interesting because typically this is behavior observed in highly mobile hunter-gatherer groups. So if you're trying to maximize cutting edge, that means you're traveling over distances where there may be uncertainty in raw material availability. So that's behavior that we typically see in Paleo-Indian and early Archaic groups. These are not diagnostic artifacts. It could just simply be technological constraints on these people. But it's interesting that they appear to be focused on provisioning themselves and focused on conserving raw material and maximizing cutting edge. Here's an example of quite a few primary reduction flakes. So as to be expected, we're at a quarry here. The vast majority of the lithic assemblage is primary reduction flakes. This orange discoloration on the artifacts occurs after they're removed from the salt water. So this is oxidation of iron or manganese. We've been kind of experimenting with some conservation methods to stop this from happening, which involves placing artifacts and slowly removing the salinity and you know, we've been kind of working on ways to remove that discoloration from them, but it's pretty insidious, and once it gets in there, it's hard to get out. There's also quite a few secondary reduction flakes at the site, but there's very few late stage items, which means that overall these people aren't producing finished points at the quarry. They're reducing things down to transportable cores that can be later finished off-site. As kind of an example of the raw material quality, here's an example of several of the flakes on a translucent background. You can see that they're, you know, light's coming through here. This is pretty high quality stuff overall. I also mentioned in situ refits. Here are two in situ refits. You can see these A and B kind of going back together here. These were recovered by divers and it was observed that they could refit back in place. There's also some interesting taphonomic things going on. Some of the artifacts, when they came out of the salt water and were washed, actually salt got in between some of these cracks. You can see there's some quite a few inclusions in the chert out there. That's pretty common in Florida overall because of just the nature of the sedimentary rock that produces Swanee limestone. It's not very homogeneous, lots of inclusions in it. But in places when these items would dry out, and we even dried them out quite slowly to avoid you know, any adverse impact to the artifacts, but in some instances, the salt would actually crystallize and pop off these flakes in the lab. So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon that I hadn't really seen before. As far as taphonomy, also, a handful of artifacts in the assemblage exhibited evidence of heat alteration in the form of crazing and pot-lidded fractures, which are kind of hard to make out here, but you can see one there. And then this is slightly discolored around the edges, this pinkish tone. So there's some kind of heat alteration going on here. I doubt this is intentional heat treating. Nearby at the Ryan Harley site, which I worked on for my dissertation, there was quite a bit of widespread evidence of wildfires in the area between about 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, at which point this outcrop would have been exposed. So it's likely this is just natural heat alteration from fires. So what's significant about the HAE 1796 site? Obviously, it's a bedrock quarry of Swanee Chert, and it's one of the first bedrock quarries identified in Apalachee Bay. So at other sites like Fitch and J&J Hunt, which are other sites in Apalachee Bay, there are artifacts, but this is a really interesting area because we can actually see people going to the resource, extracting the chert, and the decision-making process that they're using in chert reduction. So we've modeled the date of inundation for this site at about 3,000 years ago. So this is a good Terminus antiquem age for the assemblage. So it's covered over by this point, and unless we assume that people are going and extracting this rock from underwater, which is not out of the realm of possibility. We're assuming that after 3,000, the site is roughly sealed. This was all surface collected within about 2 weeks. So this could be a bias sample because our permit didn't allow for subsurface excavation. We were only surfacing sampling things that were on the surface. This seemed to be pretty representative of the site overall, though. An interesting thing that we noticed when we spatially plotted the artifact. So here is the rough outline of Clint Scalpole. Looks kind of like a weird, funky version of the state of Texas. Here's our artifact baseline. The whole place is basically this empty, barren patch where there's sand dune features interrupted by large concentrations of lithics. And what you can kind of see here is that there's two separate areas, more or less, where you have a concentration of bedrock exposures here in the northern portion of the site. And then what looks like activity areas, down here, one large activity area where maybe several people are reworking things down. Overall, as I mentioned, very few diagnostic artifacts, no diagnostic artifacts, very few tools, which is to be expected for a quarry. So 80% of the lithic assemblage is manufacturing debris. About 20% are these early stage tools and cores, and all of these are expedient. As I mentioned, there's nothing here that's diagnostic. And that's what we expect when people are working things down at a location and then removing it off-site. A big portion of the this kind of dovetails into that that earlier data point where a vast majority of the artifacts weigh over 50 grams. So this is kind of a map based on size class here, which is broken down. And this is, again, just kind of reiterating that point that there's a high degree of large-scale core reduction going on at the site. There's quite a bit of debris and shatter and broken flakes, as well as a concentration of low and medium quality raw material at the site. So this was assessed with a pretty qualitative, admittedly, just raw material score of 1, 2, and 3, where 1 was poor quality raw material. These are things that are riddled with bugs or are very coarse grained and textured, up to those items with a raw material score of 3. Which were these very nice, homogeneous shirts. And what we saw was that the concentration of items at the site were raw material scores 1 and 2, despite several bedrock outcrops being present of high quality raw material. So this is showing us intentional selective choice there, where people are taking the raw material, the high quality raw material off-site, leaving the poor quality raw material on-site, which is interesting because by intentionally making that choice, you kind of can infer that these people were provisioning themselves in some way. So chert is quite abundant on the landscape, and another decision that could be made is just things could be roughed out expediently. If somebody's not really concerned about impending decisions where their technology will be important, then perhaps they would be okay using lower quality raw materials. But the prevalence of the high quality raw materials tells us they're moving that stuff off site, and they're specifically choosing that. These items, such as blades and unifaces, are usually hallmarks of Paleo-Indian and early Archaic assemblages, but we don't have any unequivocal artifacts from the site. And it was inundated only 3,000 years ago, which means it could have been accessed up until the late Archaic. Overall, the site has pretty insecure geologic context, so this is not really a site with great contextual integrity. The substrate at the site is no deeper than about 25 centimeters of modern marine sediments overlying the Swanee limestone bedrock. We tried to identify several deeper pockets of sediment with sub-bottom profiler to extract cores. We actually couldn't get the cores, though, because the lithic material was so dense, we couldn't core through the site without, we couldn't core through these sediments without, with all the artifacts in the way, basically. But it's really interesting that the site appears to have survived marine transgression pretty well, despite being a bedrock exposed quarry. The fact that we have these individual flint knapping stations that refit back together is pretty surprising. It's definitely something that I didn't expect, being able to refit artifacts, as if they were just kind of broken yesterday. Pretty interesting. And HAE 1796, kind of coming back to the need to be able to determine more sites, identify more sites offshore, provides a really useful data point because given that we know hunter-gatherer groups, we have expectations of hunter-gatherer models where they anchor themselves around resources. The raw material outcrop of HAE 1796 is useful in this regard because we can apply these models to archaeological work in the area and kind of refine site detection methods and modeling by using this as an anchor in the landscape and trying to look around the immediate area. We expect that there's going to be, sites in the immediate area that aren't just quarries. There's likely to be some kind of short-term or even long-term campsites in the area. So we're going back out to Quinnskelepole and surveying around the area to find more archaeological sites. And that's stuff that's forthcoming this winter. That's all that I have. I have a couple of useful references here if anybody's interested in the topic, but I'll go ahead and break. And if anybody has any questions or wants to chat about anything, I am happy to do that.
Yeah, that was great talk. And so I know sometimes it takes people a couple minutes if they have a question to type it out, but so I'll give people a few minutes. But what I will do in the meantime is I promised that I would put a link to the next Zoom In to Archaeology talk, which is next week. And so I'm going to go ahead and enter that into the chat. So if you're interested in that one, just go ahead and click on that link and it will give you the information for that. And then also, like I said, this talk will be probably next week up on our YouTube channel, which is just, if you just go to youtube.com/Florida Public Archaeology Network, all spelled out, that will take you to the channel. So I'll put that up there as well. And while we wait for maybe some questions to come in, I do have a question about the site. You mentioned early on the issue with, so I see we just have a question, so I'll hold on to mine. So we have Dana wants to, he asked if you would discuss the black patina on the chert.
Dana, yeah, that's a good thing to ask. Actually, I have an example over in the lab. Maybe it's right here. No, it's over in the lab. The black patina on the chert is something that occurs in inundated contexts. So as far as we can tell, that's basically minerals that are, it's not an additive process, actually. It's minerals that are coming out of solution in the chert and staining the exterior surface. This is something that's been looked at by Adam Burke, who's wrote a master's thesis on the patina of artifacts in underwater contexts. The actual color of the chert at HAE 1796 is bright blue. So that black patina on the outside, the moment you break it open, the chert ranges from kind of light bluish to this vivid, kind of sky blue color. But that's usually, those exterior stains are kind of like a combination of iron and manganese and other elements that precipitate out of the stone when they're in underwater context.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wondered the same thing. So
yeah.
While we wait for any more questions, I was going to ask about, you mentioned looting being a problem. Is there any concern with this site with
yes,
that?
There's quite a concern with this site. We're trying to, I mean, I don't think there's much cause for people to want to go loot a quarry. There's not really much out there in terms of diagnostic artifacts, but it's a major concern. I mean, I'm really nervous that the site will get looted because the preservation is just really great, and it's a unique kind of thing in underwater archaeology to be able to get to a site before looters do. That's uncommon, especially inland, where the vast majority of archaeological sites have been looted inland in underwater contexts and were originally identified by river divers for the most part and referred to archaeologists. But yeah, it's something that's really nerve-wracking, and it's really hard to get around because obviously people are allowed to dive freely wherever they wish, and they're allowed to dive at archaeological sites. They're just not allowed to take anything. But enforcing underwater looting laws is difficult enough inland, where it's relatively easy for FWC to access places and monitor sites. But yeah, the looting of stuff offshore is a whole nother ballgame. It's kind of like the Wild West out there. It's something that I'm pretty nervous about. So we're trying to be pretty close guarded with the location of a lot of these spots.
Great, thanks. And then I wasn't totally clear. Maybe, oh, here we go. Courtney has a question. How do you tell the pieces that have broken off when they were drying from intentional flaking?
That's a good question. Basically, the pieces that break off during drying have these salt crystals inside of them that have actually like consolidated as they've dried out. So that doesn't occur on the intentional flaked artifacts. It's also something that occurred in the lab, like so it was a pretty obvious process. We'd come in one day and there's a complete core, and the next day it's got a little chip off of it where there's salt crystals growing. So, but it's something I had not seen before.
She has a follow-up. She says, do they still have a bulb?
No, they do not. That's a good question. We do not have bulbs of percussion. I think they're expanding in internal weaknesses of the stone already. I don't think it's really that similar to kind of a percussive process. They're just exploiting maybe a plane of weakness there, but they do not have bulbs of percussion. Good question.
And the gentleman who found it, you mentioned Clint. Now, I wasn't clear. Does he work for FWC, or he's just a guy?
He works for FWC, but he was not working he was not in a formal capacity when he found the site. He was just out scalloping with his family.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat so far. And so, yeah, I just want to say thank you again for doing this talk. That's such an interesting site and really kind of a pioneering field, which is really exciting. I know for certainly in the archaeological field, but I think definitely, obviously, from the attendance here to the public as well. And so, like I mentioned, if anybody's interested in some of these or future Zoom into archaeology talks, you can follow us on our Facebook page. You can join us via our newsletter. You can sign up by going to our website, which is www.fpan.us, and click on Northwest. And you can sign up for our newsletter there. And join us next week on Thursday at 3:30, and we'll hear Courtney Boran talk about her amazing research looking at the Native American history of Pensacola from the 16th century to a couple hundred years later. So again, thanks again for joining us, and then we'll see all of those who will join us next time.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who came out. And thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, no problem. We'll do it again.
Great.